Hi everybody, I'm Zilla Blitz and welcome to our deep dive first look at France 40, the second edition, published by GMT Games and designed by Mark Simonitch. Now this game you play, it's a two-player game, Hex Encounters, traditional World War II war game, where one player takes the German forces, the other player takes the Allies, and it is of course the invasion of France in 1940 and World War II. Now if you're looking for this game, as well as any other games in Mark Simonitch's expanding 'XX Hex Encounters World War II series, I would guide you to one of our sponsors and the sponsor for this video, which is Noble Knight Games. If you're looking for this game and others, they have competitive prices, great services, and they also ship overseas. So a wonderful place to check out. Links are down below. And if you do happen to make a purchase through one of the links down below, thank you very much, as that does help out the channel. Let's jump in now and get started. So let's put this game in context. This is France 40, which is in the Mark Simonitch's 'XX series, which there are over a half dozen games right now that fall into this category. This is a revised second edition of the original France 40, also of course designed by Mark Simonitch. And you might say, what's different with this one? Well, one big thing is that the game has two scenarios, but this game has a combined scenario where you combine the first scenario into the second scenario, which instead of having a 10-turn and a 12-turn scenario, now you have a 23-turn scenario covering kind of a little bit past the initial invasion by the German forces all the way up to the evacuation of Dunkirk. So a much bigger gameplay experience potentially for players to enjoy with this game. There's also modifications to rules and charts and a bunch of new units. In the general sense, there's a couple of pages in the rules that kind of modify the changes. A lot of it seems to be feedback to kind of tweak the gameplay and refine the gameplay over that first edition. Let's take a look on the back side to look at some of the overview details here. This is a two-player game. Solitaire capability is listed as a 5. That feels about right. I might go a little bit higher, maybe 5.5, 6-ish kind of thing, as there really doesn't seem to be anything in here that inhibits solitaire play, although there are no accommodations necessarily made for it. So it sits kind of right in that sweet spot of, I think, a very good solitaire game where you can play both sides. Now, gameplay here is listed as 4 to 6 hours. I think that longer 23-turn massive scenario where you're combining the two maps would probably be considerably longer, but those 10-turn and the 12-turn scenarios, of which we'll talk a little bit more in detail of as we look inside, I think those make sense for that 4 to 6 hour range. There's a pretty substantial set of counters, and those turns are going to be quite involved as you're kind of moving through your actions in different phases of gameplay. In the game, each turn, so we have the 10-turn and 12-turn scenario, each turn represents 1 day, and units are at the division, brigade, regiment, and battalion level. So kind of a mid-range operational level game. Now, complexity is a 5. I'll talk more about that as we get into the rulebook. Let's jump inside and take a look at what's inside. So we have 2 dice, a black and a blue die, and we have baggies to store the units if you would so like. We'll put those off to the side. There are 2 documents here. We have the playbook and then we have the rules of play. Let's start in with the rules of play here. The rulebook is 24 pages and the rules actually go up to, what is it really here? Page 18, where we start to get more scenario descriptions here. Although to be fair, the scenarios also include some other rule elaborations for that particular scenario here. The rules here, I mean, if we look at the complexity, it's really nicely laid out, 2-column layout, good graphics to enhance the explanations. I kind of look at at Mark Simonitch's series here, this, the 'XX series, if you would, is kind of Hex Encounters Wargaming evolved. So it's really got kind of that meat and potatoes Hex Encounters feel to it, but there's a lot of enhancements and a lot of elaborations that drive up the complexity a little bit too, but also make it so much more of a rewarding experience. For one thing, where the complexity goes up a little bit is that you don't necessarily have stacking by units. You have stacking by kind of the stacking value of the unit. So there are, you can have 6 stacking points in a unit, but different units, depending on their size, are going to have different stacking values. So that ramps up the complexity, but it makes it a little bit more realistic and gives you a lot more options as to how gameplay gameplay would play out. One of the big things that this game is famous for, of course, is its zone of control bonds. And this is explained in the Rule 6 here with this little graphic down here as well. This is kind of a unique innovation for this series that modifies how units connect and protect units from protect their front lines and things. So really fun enhancements in here. There's determined defense too, which is another enhancement. And then there's rail movement as well as a lot of other rules in here that kind of captures some of the historical flavor of this campaign, where certain allied units are going to be restricted in how they can react. And also you've got a halt in one of the scenarios here. The German armored forces can kind of, comparing to the historical, they actually have to halt their advance because they were called off to be able to advance further into France at one point in time. So a lot of historical variation in rules that kind of ramp up a traditional Hex Encounters game to make it be a little bit more. Now, what does that mean for complexity? I think we're looking at the rule book. The back of the box says a 5. I feel like that's high. I'd be more inclined to go a 4, maybe a little bit higher, 4.5. But it feels like compared to other war games that this really doesn't quite go that high. So I wouldn't let the complexity scare you, although this might not be, if you're new to Hex Encounters wargaming, this would probably not be the easiest place to start. Let's take a look now at the playbook here, which is 16 pages. A lot of this is a sickle cut extended example of play, so we get a lot of different kind of a 2-page here extended example of play, which is always helpful in learning the game. And these are those first edition notes and second edition notes that we're talking about, things that have been changed, things that have been added. And it looks like they've really gone through this with a fine-tooth comb to kind of tweak the gameplay while keeping the kind of the essence of the original game as well. Then we have order of battle notes here. We have situation maps, which get into the historical flavor and the historical action. So really just kind of a neat look at the history of the campaign as we go down here. And then the back end of this playbook is the France 40 combined game, where you take the 2 maps, and we'll take a look at those later, combine them into one massive map, and you can play the first scenario connected to the second scenario. So the first scenario, by the way, to talk about those, is a sickle cut scenario, which is basically kind of the Germans' initial slash across France. And then Dynamo is where you're trying to rescue the Allied units out of places like Dunkirk to save as many of the Allied forces as you can. So if you combine those, of course, you do sickle cut first and then Dynamo second on one larger combined map. And this is new to that second edition here. Then lastly, we have some combined game design notes, and then some bibliography and some credits. So really nice playbook to kind of enhance what's going on. Let's take a look now at some of our units here. We have 2 counter sheets, and the unit size is 9/16 of an inch. We have 384 counters in all. Most of these are actual military counters, and only a relatively small amount of them are markers to be used on top of the counters. Now, again, to get an idea of, let's take a look here first here. This is counter sheet 1, which has mostly our German units on the left-hand side, and then our French units on the right-hand side. To give an idea a little bit on this idea of the enhanced complexity of the game, let's take a look at some of the units and just walk through some of the values. So if we start, for example, with this German armored unit here, we get 3 numbers along the lower left-hand side. Very standard. This would be attack and then defense and then movement along the right. We'll also notice there's a black 2 just to the right of the armored unit there. And what that number is, that is the stacking value. So you have a certain amount of stacking points per hex, and then you can't exceed that. So rather than being on a unit basis, that's dependent upon this stacking value. Now, there are also some exceptions to that, where you can add some armored units in certain circumstances, and if they're all of the same division, you can exceed that as well. It kind of counts for a different number. So there is, again, this gives an idea that it's Hex Encounters wargaming, a little bit more complexity, a little bit more to it, and a little bit more meat to it as well. The middle number here, you'll notice also the defense value is in red. This means that it's an elite unit. Compare that to, if we look over here to one of these French infantry units with a white box behind it, that means the troop quality is low quality for this one. And there are other things as well too. For example, these French units in here, 232, have a black box around their movement. That means there are restrictions on when they can be released to move in the game depending upon certain circumstances. So a bunch of different things in here. Oh, also one more right underneath this, we have a French armored unit, which is an 8. This is a heavy armor unit here that designates that as such with the yellow box behind the attack value. And also not every one of these, but a lot of these units have a depleted state, which we can see in the backhand side. So both counter sets are printed on both sides. So again, just kind of a little overview on how the units work work in this game. A lot of these are really nice. Again, 9/16. They will need to be trimmed. Get out your counter trimmer for these. Taking a look at the colors of the units too. Here we have German and French. These dark blue are French colonial units. Then as we come over here, we have some SS units that are black, Luftwaffe units that are a different shade here, British units that are these khaki units here, Belgian units in green, and then Dutch units over here in orange to fill out the command pool here. So really nice counter set, looks good, nice size. Nice to see them a little bit bigger than 1/2 inch too at 9/16. Let's jump in now and take a look at our player aids. There are 2 of them. Actually, there are more. There are 2 main player aids here, of which they are identical. So I always like when games do this, 1 for each player. So basically, it's going to make it really nice. Just kind of standard. We have our combat results table in here. Then we have a sequence of play, which again, we can see, as we fill this out. This, by the way, very much is what I would call kind of almost a standard sequence of play, where you're going to have an initial phase, then Germans are going to move, German combat's going to happen, there's some recovery, you're checking for supply, and then you're going to move on to the Allied phase where they do that. So it's very much a back and forth. There isn't a chit pull sequence in here, and there are no cards in this game to drive the action. So again, kind of going back to that core of this is Hex Encounters Wargaming, traditional Hex Encounters Wargaming, just enhanced and elaborated and built off and kind of modernized, if you would. A bunch of other tables here for isolated attrition, rally, disengagement, evacuation for this dynamo scenario down here, and then breakthrough combat up here. And then lastly, the terrain effects chart, as one would expect. Then, very nice, always like when we see this, this is the order of battles here, if you would, in the setup cards for both of the scenarios. So the Dynamo is on one side for the Germans, Sickle Cut is on the other, Dynamo, and then Sickle Cut for the French here too. And really nice, this is so helpful. This would take a long time to do just by unit names. It's always appreciated when you see a game that has visual references here, because then you can just kind of drop these units down here and then move them right to the board. So it just makes it, or put them right on the board as you're going, just makes it so much easier to get set up and so much faster. So that's always really appreciated. Let's jump in now and take a look at our 2 maps. Now these are the paper maps that come with the game. There are, as an optional purchase, there are mounted maps that are a mounted map that is available. Be aware that the paper maps are what you will need if you're going to play the combined scenario. And we're looking right now at the Sickle Cut scenario map here. The Dynamo map sits on top of that. We'll look at that one momentarily. But if you want to, the mounted map is one map with Sickle Cut on one side and Dynamo on the other. So you won't be able to use the mounted map for the combined scenario. You're basically going to overlap these 2 maps, Sickle Cut and Dynamo, to play the combined scenario if you want that. If we look at this, each hex is roughly 4 miles across, and the hex size is 3/4 of an inch. So we have 9/16 units with 3/4 across. Really nice detail, real clear, I think just a really easy executable map that looks like it's going to be very, very functional. Most of what we can see too, if we look up here on these edges, we can see these kind of entry and exit points here. These are north and things like that for the maps, and X's are over here. And that gets us a little bit to the victory conditions for this Sickle Cut scenario, because the German forces are going to be starting over here to the east and kind of working their way across the map. And their goal really is to cut this map in half, hence the Sickle Cut name, where a big point of the victory conditions is, can the French and the Allies maintain a connection between this north edge and this west edge here? So basically, the Germans are trying to drive to Abbeville here and to cut that off to prevent the Allies from winning. And the Allies, again, fighting on the defensive. And that's one of the questions I'm really curious to see, is what it's like to play as the French and the Allies in this, because you're really going to be on your heels. Germans are going to be covering ground, and you're fighting a fighting withdrawal, trying to prevent them from making it all the way to the English Channel there. So that is our Sickle Cut map. Let's take a quick look at Dynamo next. So I'll pull this one out now. Again, both of these maps are 22 by 34 inches long here, so 22 inches tall by 34 inches wide. When you combine them, the combined scenario, if you're looking for that footprint, it's 36 inches tall by 34 inches wide. There's a substantial overlap between the two. And Dynamo, again, we can see here, this part, we can see Abbeville down here, and that's what's overlapping. About this much of the map is overlapping with the Sickle Cut scenario. So here we get more of the Netherlands. And again, this is Dynamo. You're basically, as the allies, you're trying to get stuff out here of Dunkirk. You can also go out of Calais and then Ostend here. I'm not sure how you quite pronounce that one, apologies. But you're trying to evacuate your forces here. As the Germans, you're trying to prevent that from happening. And you're trying to get, I think the allies are trying to get out 15 units. And here we can see the evacuated unit box to get out there. And so really, as the Germans, you're trying to prevent that from happening. The allies, you're trying to save as many people as you possibly can. And we can see up in here, we get the Netherlands and things moving on in there too. So there we have it, France 40 from Mark Simonitch, one of the second edition in his expanding series of games covering World War II Hex Encounters combat. Love to hear your comments down below, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.